Have you ever been handed a letter at your own birthday table that said you were no longer family while everyone filmed it with their phones? My name is Maya Bennett. I am 29 years old, and at the time, I was working as a front desk agent at a boutique hotel downtown. They thought I was just the girl at the desk, the person who checked coats and refilled water. What they did not know was that the person they laughed at had spent a decade learning hospitality systems, negotiating corporate contracts, and quietly building relationships with travel directors at major firms. I am telling you this because that night changed everything, and I promise you, the story does not end where the camera started to roll. To understand why I did not break, you need to go back with me to what came before, to the small choices and secrets that made a difference. If you have ever been underestimated by family, type "me too" in the comments below and stay with me because what happened next is both terrible and eventually astonishing. My family, by reputation, was the kind that looks like a headline. My father, Mark Bennett, ran a small chain of development companies and was used to introductions at donor dinners. My mother, Helen Bennett, volunteered on boards and wore jewelry that clicked when she laughed. My younger sister, Olivia, studied international relations at a private university and seemed to always be at the right table. My brother Ethan worked in finance and liked to drop metrics in casual conversation to show he belonged. To people who met us at galas or private boxes at concerts, our name suggested wealth and steadiness. At home, the reality was different. Money was an impression kept with careful language, and status was a script everyone tried to follow. I learned early that silence and service made a person invisible in that script, and I played the role without complaint because it was easier than arguing about a budget or a reputation. I was not always the person who wiped down the brass bell and booked suites with a polite smile. When I was 14, I repaired my first computer for an elderly neighbor, then taught myself basic coding at night while flipping through industry books in the public library. My college years were a patchwork of scholarships, overnight shifts, and volunteer shifts at tourism boards where I learned to read customer reports and to draft proposals that actually got funding. After college, I took a job at a mid-range hotel to pay rent, and little by little, I moved from reservations to revenue management projects. At 25, I completed a hospitality certification that taught yield management and channel distribution, and I started to present small reports to the general manager. People like Rosa Kim, the training director who became my early mentor, and Jamal Rivera, a bookings manager who covered for my shifts, pushed me to present my ideas. Rosa said, "Your slides speak like a business plan." And Jamal, with his easy sarcasm, would add, "You just need someone who will listen long enough to hear the numbers." Those small affirmations mattered. They were fuel for the long nights rebuilding spreadsheets and reading market reports while my family rehearsed their image for press releases. That backstory is important because it explains why the humiliation I endured could also be the trigger for a reversal that felt inevitable to me. A few months before the birthday dinner, there was an incident at work that should have been prompt recognition. A corporate travel group arrived with a multi-city delegation that included a delegation from Tokyo, and a booking glitch threatened to leave them without rooms. The general manager was out of town, and the on-duty supervisor, Leah Carter, made a call to me more as a courtesy than with expectation. The scene smelled like old coffee and lemon cleaner, phone chargers dangling from a counter, and the air conditioning unit kicking on with a distant hum. I remember the texture of the dispatch sheet under my palms and the tinny ringtone of the hotel line. I picked up the pieces. I wrote an email to 3 vendor contacts, I rerouted reservations, and I negotiated late checkout and shuttle times with a driver named Marcus, who knew the city routes like a map folded into his head. There were direct messages, frantic calls, and then a calm conversation with the delegation leader. The delegation leader, who later introduced himself as Daniel Park, said, "You handled this seamlessly. Who trained you?" Leah shrugged and said, "Maya did most of it." The following morning, there was a note from the corporate office praising swift problem-solving that preserved a key partnership, and attaching occupancy metrics that showed we retained the account. That email sat in my sent items like a small secret trophy. My father never saw it. My mother never forwarded it to her friends. But Daniel Park saw competence in what my family called invisible labor, and his name would reappear. A month later, I received an unexpected message on LinkedIn. The notification pinged while I was polishing keys and folding registration cards, and the light above the counter picked out a tiny sheen on the leather of my shoes. The message was concise and professional. It read, "Maya, this is Daniel Park from Lumen Hospitality. Would you be open to a conversation about a regional operations role?" My heart thudded against the ribs in a way I felt like the air itself could hear. I forwarded the message to Rosa with a shaky caption. She answered with 3 fire emojis and a practical note. "Prepare examples, be ready to explain the bookings issue." The initial interview was a video call with Daniel and the head of talent, Leah Montgomery, who asked me to walk through a real case. I opened my old spreadsheet, shared my screen, and walked them through occupancy curves, channel segmentation, and a small 5-page proposal I had drafted that recommended a partnership with a corporate travel consortium. Daniel said, "This is clear. You are thinking like an operator with a strategy capability." He offered me a preliminary task contract to run a pilot for 2 months. The contract terms were written in crisp sentences, mentioning a performance-based bonus and equity vesting, explained simply as a promise that if certain revenue metrics were met, I would receive a piece of the project. I read the clause about vesting and explained it to Rosa out loud that night because I needed to put technical language into plain speech to feel it as real. Pressure built in ways I had not wanted to admit. The workload increased, my shifts lengthened, and the domestic scene tightened, as if we were all sitting under a lid. The stress felt physical. There were nights where my neck clicked as I yawned and felt an ache that a hot shower did not fix. I started seeing Dr. Patel, a therapist, who asked me to name the small betrayals. She said, "Boundaries are not selfish, Maya. They are survival." I recall the smell of the clinic, antiseptic and chamomile, the fabric of the waiting room chairs, and the soft sound of her pen on paper as she wrote notes. My finances were fragile. I had saved enough for a deposit on a small apartment, but not for an exit that would make sense without employment. I had a friend, Marcus, who stayed up nights taking shift swaps for me. I talked to Jamal about contingency plans. I explain numbers to myself now in the same way I used to explain them to executives, because numbers make choices less emotional. 3 months of runway, a signed pilot contract with Lumen, a promise of travel, and a decision to not publicly disclose until I could secure the offer that protected me. The feeling of being cornered by family expectations while clutching contractual possibility is a pressure cooker. It is worth naming because that pressure is what steeled me for what would happen on my birthday. The birthday dinner happened on June 12 at Parkside Grill, a place where the waiters fold linen around plates with theatrical care, and the lighting makes every table look like a photograph. My mother booked the corner with velveteen chairs. I came in wearing the same clothes I had worked in, a simple blouse and a jacket folded in my bag because my shifts were not over. Olivia had a dress that caught the low lights like a surface of glass. Ethan arrived with a story about a conference, and my father walked in with a presence that filled the small room. The air smelled of rosemary and seared meat, and the background had a murmur of low laughter. Someone had set up a camera on a tripod at the edge of the table, too. The first course arrived warm and fragrant, the feel of the bread crusting at my fingertips. Conversation floated lightly until my father cleared his throat and reached into a white envelope. The moment that followed is one I relive with a mixture of heat and cold. He read words that said I was no longer recognized as family, citing reasons that sounded rehearsed, and handed the envelope to me as the phones came out. People at other tables looked up. A woman at the bar whispered a question, as if asking for plot permission. My sister, eyes wide, said, "Dad, you cannot do this now." He said, "I can do whatever I want at my table." The interactions were short and jagged, like thrown pebbles. The dinner scene became a play of voices. I tried to respond, and the exchanges stretched long enough to be a scene in a film with multiple beats. I will replicate the dialogue because the way words were used matters. I said, "What is this?" My father answered, "It is what we decided is best for the family reputation." I asked, "Did you talk to me first?" Helen said, "This is not about talking, Maya. This is about consequences." Olivia intervened with, "You are hurting her." Ethan, with a tone my brother always uses when he needs to be anywhere else, said, "Can we stop? This is ridiculous." A cousin named Laura, who had driven in from the suburbs, whispered, "At least be discreet." A distant uncle, Tom, laughed in a way that sounded like someone turning a page to a new scandal. The manager at the restaurant, Daniel, who I later learned was not related to the Daniel Park at Lumen but shared a rare name, came by our table with a polite concern, asking, "Is everything all right here?" He saw my hands trembling as I held the letter and said, "If you need anything, we can move you to the private room." A guest at the next table, a tall man with a crisp suit and a watch that flashed under the light, leaned across in a move that made him look part interference and part ally, and he said in a clear voice, "Excuse me, I hope I am not interrupting, but do you need help?" That man was Daniel Park, and the timing felt like something arranged by fate. The phones around us recorded my father's words and my mother's composed face and my own attempt to speak. The tension in the room was a physical thing, a taut wire that vibrated with every syllable. There were moments in those minutes when time stretched and the camera zoomed in, not only on the paper, but on the small facts that made a life. I will slow the moment for you to feel it as I felt it. I lifted the letter and read it aloud because silence would have been a consent. The words were official and yet flimsy. The paper smelled of printer ink and cheap cologne. The room's sound became the scrape of a chair and the cough of someone trying to swallow embarrassment. My mouth tasted metallic, like the penny rumor of adrenaline. I could have broken. The pain was sharp and sudden, and then a pressure under the ribs that taught me to breathe differently. In that slow space, Daniel Park stood and addressed the whole table in a voice that was steady, with a small authority that made the room listen. He said, "Forgive me for interrupting, but I have met Maya in a professional capacity, and I would like to make an announcement." My father made a small noise, like an accusation, and my mother squeezed her napkin as if to hold a composure together. Daniel continued, "I asked Maya to consult on a pilot project for our regional portfolio. She has produced results. I would like to invite you all to hear that the company will be partnering with her for expansion." That sentence landed like a bell. My family laughed first, as if it were a joke, and then the reality stitched itself in the face of the cameras. The surprise was public. The reversal began in the moment someone outside our family said my name with authority. The weeks before the dinner had a secret I had not disclosed. I had signed an agreement with Lumen that included a clause ensuring that if I was publicly shamed while the pilot was in process, the company would accelerate my hiring and provide relocation and a severance buffer. The contract details mattered, and I remember the evening I signed, the way the fine paper felt under my fingertips, and the lift of the pen, as if it was an anchor. The signature had a timeline attached, equity that would vest if metrics met targets, and a promise of a promotion path. The signing itself was quiet. It was at a glass table in an office that smelled like new coffee and the faint lemon of cleaners, and there were 3 people: Daniel, Leah Montgomery from Talent, and Rosa on a speakerphone, offering a short, fierce, "Good for you." In our exchange, Daniel said, "We want someone who can do more than operations, someone who can think product and people." I said, "I will deliver metrics and a replicable playbook." Leah asked, "Will you be open to moving if the pilot scales?" I answered, "If the numbers support it, yes." There were smiles and a small handshake that felt like an agreement much heavier than the paper. That handshake and the contract were my ticket, though I had not planned to reveal them that night. I had decided to hold the proof like a card in a closed fist until I could ensure the terms. I had chosen strategy over spectacle. The public reversal unfolded over days. Daniel Park, to his credit, followed through in a way that felt like justice with policy behind it. He called a media briefing to present the pilot's early results, and he invited me to stand on stage as the operations lead who had designed the deployment strategy that saved a partnership and improved occupancy metrics by 12% in 3 weeks. The gala where this happened was in a civic hall with chandeliers and the kind of echo that turns applause into a wave. The air smelled of perfume and polished wood. I stood near a podium, and the lights were warm enough to make the room look like a photograph of optimism. The cameras cut to our table in the front row, where my family had been invited to sit after a polite intervention. My father folded his hands as if preparing to address the room, while my mother clutched a program like a shield. When Daniel said my name and described the work I had done, the sound of my name in a large room was not small. He said, "Maya Bennett designed a playbook that moved key metrics and preserved our key accounts. She will be joining us as Regional Operations Director." The room reacted. Reporters murmured into their recorders. Olivia's face turned pale and then flushed. Ethan's jaw went tight. There were flashes from cameras, and comments on social feeds began to appear with the speed of someone taking down notes. The public had a way of translating my private humiliation into a new refrain. Social posts used words like reputation and scandal next to my name, and editorials with the vocabulary of business started to track the pilot metrics I had produced. A business column in a national paper quoted occupancy numbers and described how a local employee had brought operational insight that saved corporate accounts. It listed figures and used words like pilot, scale, and process, and it mentioned a contract that included equity and a promotion path. The proof of competence was now not only my memory of spreadsheets, but also a set of metrics attached to a corporate partnership and a byline that put my work into public view. My father called me from the table at the gala and said something that sounded like a question about etiquette, and I realized in that moment that names and titles had weight in the room he valued. He later texted, "Is this for real?" I replied, "Look up the filings and the press release. I did the work." His silence was telling. The months that followed shifted my life in concrete ways. At 1 month, I had officially relocated to the regional office. My title on the company site read Operations Director, and I had a key card and an office plant that someone gifted as a corporate joke. I remember the first morning commute, the smell of rain on asphalt, and the way my coat slid over my shoulders. I sat with a stack of reports and the team that included Jamal as a bookings liaison and Leah Montgomery as talent advisor. The early results were public and measured: a 12% uplift in key account retention, a reduction in overbooking by 7%, and a pilot that produced a template Lumen decided to scale to 3 additional properties. At 3 months, the pilot contract triggered the first tranche of equity vesting, explained to me as a small ownership in the project, contingent on defined metrics. And that vesting translated into a clear financial buffer that allowed me to secure an apartment of my own instead of relying on family provision. I remember signing the lease, the smell of new paint, and the way the keys felt heavy with possibility. At 6 months, my promotion became formalized as a regional director with a compensation package that included an equity component, a relocation allowance, and an executive coach paid by the company to help with leadership transition. We hit revenue targets in month 5, and the board circulated an internal memo thanking the team for strategic execution. The consequences extended beyond numbers. I donated a modest portion of my signing bonus to a scholarship fund at the public library where I had taught myself to code because I wanted to create access. I hired Marcus in a permanent role as a city liaison because he had helped me when it mattered, and I offered Rosa a consulting engagement to train new managers because she had invested in me. I also put clear boundaries in place. I blocked family accounts that made threats, and I engaged with Dr. Patel to set limits for phone calls that arrived late at night with criticism disguised as concern. The public reaction included profiles that called it a scandal for my family and a triumph for meritocracy. Some donors withdrew from events that had been organized around my father, and some board chairs asked for meetings to discuss governance. There were awkward conversations, and some doors closed, but several professional doors opened that had been sealed to me before. I will not pretend the fallout was clean. There were legal notes from my father's attorneys asking for retractions, and there was an op-ed that called the situation messy. There were friends who took sides and friends who left. There were nights when the alone feeling returned, and I had to remember my breath and the work that got me here. But there was also a community I built at Lumen and beyond, people who became my chosen family in the way Rosa and Jamal had long been. I learned to translate personal boundaries into corporate language and to treat my well-being as a policy rather than an apology. If you have ever been reduced by someone who should have supported you, I see you, and I want to hear from you. If my story resonates, write me a comment that says, "Me too." And if you feel like sharing, tell me in one sentence where it happened. Every story you leave helps someone else realize they are not alone and helps me choose what to cover next. This channel is for people who turned small actions into leverage. Your words matter. Now, stay with me because the next part is about how I used the first months to build not just a career, but a structure that would protect other people who do the invisible work. Looking back, the arc is simple to name, but complex to live. I went from being a person who checked coats to someone who negotiated metrics for a regional portfolio. The proof is concrete: a contract that led to a 12% increase in retention, an equity tranche that vested at 3 months, a relocation allowance, and a formal promotion to regional director at 6 months. I hired 2 people from my community, donated to a scholarship that supported public education, and created a small internal policy at Lumen that recognizes frontline contributions in performance review cycles. I also found a therapist who helped me define limits and a mentor who taught me how to convert skills into strategic currency. There's a practical rule I live by now, which I offer as a takeaway. Measure your work, document it, and make sure there is a paper trail that ties your effort to outcomes. Numbers make conversations less emotional and more actionable. In the end, the memorable detail is simple. They put a letter on my birthday table to erase me, and the man who stood up from another table used my name in front of everyone as a credential. That moment exposed the truth that reputation without competence is paper thin. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories that blend personal truth with concrete lessons, and join a community that turns humiliation into strategy. They tried to erase me, and I wrote my name into the record.